pleased to welcome you to this public lecture by Professor Alexey K. Pushkov. As you know, I only make, the students of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy will know that I only make 3 points in my introduction. The first point about Russia. Second point about the rather interesting history that Russia has had. And then about our speaker. And I'll be very, very brief. I suppose the most important point to note about Russia, especially if you live in Singapore, is that Russia is the largest country in the world, and Singapore is probably the smallest country in the world. And it's quite a contrast, by the way. And that's why, as you know, the potential for Russia is enormous. And that's why when the Goldman Sachs report came out, they highlighted 4 countries, as you know, the BRIC countries. And the BRIC countries, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And what's amazing is that the BRIC countries actually, amazingly enough, as a result of the Goldman Sachs report, began to meet among themselves. And they had a BRIC meeting, and this is where, surprisingly, an American investment bank was able to influence the course of history by bringing together the countries with the greatest potential in the world. And of course, as you all know, Russia has always played a major role in the world. And this brings me to my second point about the history of Russia. Because I must say, a lot of countries have had interesting histories. But Russia, I would say, has had a particularly significant history, especially in the last, I guess, 20 years or so since the end of the Cold War. It's been a very exciting drama. I remember when I was ambassador to the UN in 1985, 86, the Cold War seemed to be permanent. The 2 superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, seemed to be permanent. And if anybody had said, hey, the Soviet Union will go away and something different would emerge, everybody would say, no, it never happened, but it happened, right? One of the biggest surprises in the world was how the Soviet Union, in a sense, left the scene peacefully and created a whole new geopolitical environment. And Russia went through some very interesting challenges, I think you would agree, domestically, regionally, globally. At the end of the day, you can see that Russia has once again emerged as a major power, a major player in the world, and resume its natural weight and status in the world. And this is why, frankly, it is very important for us at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy to learn more about Russia and its views on the world. And this, of course, then brings me to my third point, which is that we have, in some ways, probably one of the best possible speakers you can bring from Moscow to Singapore to come and explain what's happening in Russia. Professor Alexey Pushkov was born in 1954 and graduated from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations and also has a PhD in international relations. And that's why he, as he told me earlier, he wears 3 hats, right? He's with the Diplomatic Academy, which is affiliated with the Foreign Ministry in Russia. And both he and I compared notes about a good mutual friend we have in common, the current Foreign Minister of Russia, whose name is Sergei Lavrov. And I had the pleasure of sitting side by side with Sergei Lavrov because in the Security Council, Russia and Singapore sat side by side. And I came to discover that Sergei Lavrov can drink much more than I can drink.
Well, the country is bigger.
The country is bigger. Big country can drink more. Well, he's a wonderfully brilliant ambassador and also a brilliant foreign minister and, of course, a mutual friend that Alexey and I have. He's also the host of a very successful TV program called Postscriptum, which has had a major impact in Russia. And I can tell you that the man who, incidentally, who introduced us to Professor Alexey Pushkov is someone none other than Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew. He met him in Moscow and said, this man is very interesting. And he said, why didn't you invite him to Singapore? We said, we're very happy to do so. And he's also, by the way, he also has an academic hat also that he wears. So he wears 3 hats at the same time. So you can see that he's, in a sense, in the best possible position to tell us about what's happening. I should also mention he's got lots of other international affiliations, but if I read the whole list, we'll end up taking a long time. He's going to speak to us for about 30 minutes, and I can also tell you, by the way, I hope this is good news for you, that we will actually be finishing around 6:45 p.m. instead of 7:15 p.m. because I have to go home and host a dinner for him to meet some other visitors. So I'm welcoming Professor Alexey and his wife to my house for dinner at 7:30. So if you don't mind, we'll finish at 6:45. So with that, over to you, Alexey.
I'm very honored and pleased to speak in such a renowned audience. It is interesting to note that we have been discussing this with Professor Mahbubani. The New Asian Hemisphere, that's the title of your book, which I will bring to Moscow, and maybe, or I think even certainly, it will be published in in Russia.
Okay, a round of applause for him, please. This guy knows how to win votes.
The New Asian Hemisphere is becoming more and more important in the world, and usually I got invitations from American institutions like the Council of Foreign Affairs or European institutions like the German Foreign Policy Society. In the 90s, not so many Russian academics and special experts would get invitations from the Asian Hemisphere. In the 2000s, things started to change. People started to go more to China, to Japan, to India. There is, I would say, a new intellectual expansion of the Asian countries, of the New Asian Hemisphere, which is taking a more important economic, but not only economic role. I feel that there is some much more intellectual activity, much more interest towards the outer world. And I hope that our today's meeting will be part of this new interaction between Russia and Singapore, which has been developing lately. My topic today is Russia between the United States and China in the 21st century, but I think I will take on some other issues which are important for the understanding of today's Russia development and today's Russia policy and its relationship with the New Asian Hemisphere. Well, we all know that the world order is evolving. The question is, where does it evolve? What can be said for certain, and it has been recognized by our American colleagues, that we are living through the end of the unipolar moment. The so-called unipolar world did not happen. Or I would say it reflected a certain American dream, which I think, to my mind, was bipartisan. Both Democrats and Republicans thought that there will be an American century, and in this, Sarah Palin is not different from Bill Clinton, although personally they're very different, as you know. The failure of the unipolar world, to my mind, is not just a failure of the United States. I think it was just unfeasible. The unipolar world could not have happened. Bush, by his policies centered on military means of exercising power, has just brought the end of the unipolar moment closer. If the policy would have been more intelligent, more strategic, less ideological, and if he didn't listen to some neoconservatives, which were extremely active in the United States in the 90s and the 2000s, I think that maybe the unipolar moment would have lasted 20, 25 years. But with the war in Iraq, I think that the moment when Bush came to this aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf and said, "We have won the war," it was May 1st, 2003. I think that was the end of the unipolar moment. And the events since that time proved that it was not a victory, definitely. It is not a military defeat, but it's a political defeat. And in the world of politics, image counts sometimes as much as in the world of finance. If you are not up to the task you have set before yourself, you are losing in the image, and then everybody all of a sudden starts to speak about the decline of the United States. I was amazed to notice that the Americans themselves talked a lot about the decline of the United States. I remember a piece by Roger Altman, I think he was deputy finance minister in the Clinton administration, and he wrote a piece in the winter issue of Foreign Affairs saying that it was 2009, the beginning of the crisis actually. He said this crisis will spell the end of the American dominance. China will win from this weakening of the United States, and the whole world is changing. And reading him, I thought that maybe it is true that we're already living in not in the American century, but in the Chinese century. But then I understood that this is the so-called new American catastrophism. You know, when Americans were so used to a position of dominance that losing even 10% of this dominance leads them to very catastrophic prediction that they will become a country like Argentina, and China will dictate all over the world, even you know, in the Western Hemisphere, how things should be built and how things should be done. I think, of course, this is an overstatement. In Russia, by the way, there was also a school of thought, which died already, that predicted that the dollar will fall, that America will become just a medium-range power, you know, these kind of things. It all happened in the spring 2008 and winter 2009, when the crisis was raging and it was not clear what will be the impact of the Bush years on American standing in the world. But I think that 2 years since the beginning of the crisis, the conclusion we can come to is that America is suffering a relative decline, but I would like to strengthen the word relative. America is still the only superpower. America is the country which probably by the most important criterion of might is the only one which responds to those criteria. Take the military might, the economic might, still $14.7 trillion of GNP is something which is not equaled, and China is lagging very, very far behind for the time being. It has 3 times less GNP. Informational influence is unparalleled. I mean, of course, a number of countries are trying to launch their own, for instance, international TV broadcasting, like the French have started France 24, the Chinese have a couple of English-speaking channels, and Russia has a channel which is called Russia Today. But of course, it cannot be compared with CNBC, with CNN, and Fox, and all the others which have a global network of informational presence. The cultural influence of the United States is still very strong. Of course, people have a lot of skeptical comments about the Coca-Cola culture, but it's around us, and the American way of life is something which does exist. The Chinese way of life, I'm not sure. It is probably yet to happen, if it happens in our lifetime. So culturally, America is still very much a dominant power. Also, from the point of view of the so-called soft power, I think that American might is very impressive. In the field of high technologies, in the field of innovation, I think that China is still on the receiving end, and America is on the generating end of the link. Also, America is the only country in the world which has an array of military alliances, and the only true military alliance in the world, which is NATO, is headed basically by the United States. Of course, if you talk to people from Luxembourg, they will tell you that everybody is equal in NATO. But as we know, since George Orwell has written his Animal Farm, we know that some animals are more equal than the others. And so in NATO, of course, America is much more equal than all the other members. America has a very important presence in Asia. Military alliances with Japan, with Taiwan, with South Korea, the presence of American military fleet. So these criteria of power are declared to be obsolete by some people. They say that today it's all about high tech, about economy, about finance. I'm not that sure. I'm not that sure. If you talk to people in Afghanistan, they will say the military dimension is definitely not obsolete. And of course, it's also creates such potential might as deterrence, for instance, the capacity to project military power abroad, which all other countries, including American partners in NATO, lack. The system of strategic space surveillance through satellites, which is basically now China tries to start to compete with the United States in this, but there are very few countries which have this system of satellite reconnaissance. It's the United States, Russia, China. The Europeans are starting to do some things in this area, but they are very much lagging behind. So I would be the one who would say that we cannot write off the United States as the leading power of the world. Yet, it does not negate the fact that we are now living not in a unipolar, but in a multipolar world. And this is a multipolar world which differs from the world we had in the beginning of the 20th century, because one can argue that in the beginning of the 20th century, there were also a number of poles. There was Germany, there was Great Britain, there was France, there was Russia, there was the United States as a growing power at that time. But the difference today is that we experience multipolarity in the conditions of globalization. And this creates a new phenomenon. Globalizations make multipolarity different from the multipolar world which existed before in human history. We are living through three crises, either looming or real crises, which have already happened. It's the economic crisis, the ecological crisis, and the energy crisis. When I'm talking about the energy crisis, I mean that potentially the humanity is facing an energy crisis. And so the issue of energy security is extremely important in today's world politics. And facing those three, either real or potential crises, basically the world, I think, has come to a new notion of interaction and interdependence, which did not exist before. And I also have the impression that Barack Obama is the embodiment of this new reality. The Americans have chosen Barack Obama not just a non-Bush, you know, because there was a joke in the United States that Barack Obama got his Nobel Peace Prize for being not being a Bush, just for this, you know. And it's an American joke, by the way. I think that is... Well, it sounds Russian, but it isn't. Russians make the best jokes about themselves, not about Barack Obama. This is just one reason. I think there is some truth in it, but it is just one reason. I think that the second reason why Obama has become the President of the United States, it was basically an acquiescence by the Americans that the world has changed, and they have to try a different way of behaving and a different way of thinking. Now you see that there is a backlash in the United States. You see the Republican come back on those last elections, and you see the Tea Party in the United States. So, I mean, the choice America has made for a new president of new thinking is, I don't think it's a final choice. I think there may be some backlashes, conservative backlashes in the United States, but actually Barack Obama is the president of the new age. Barack Obama is a recognition of the fact that America cannot do it alone, neither in ecology, evidently for evident reasons, nor in energy, also for evident reasons, and nor in economy. As we have seen, at some point, I remember our American friends were even saying that now all our hopes are based in China, so that China will become the new locomotive of the world economy. It was in 2009 when Americans felt really bad. And so they said China will drag us from the crisis. So we are living in a multipolar world, in a more world which is marked by more interaction, but we still don't know what the new world order will be. Because what is this world order? What kind of world order we are living in? I think we are in a transitional state from an old world order to a new world order. And a lot of things are still coming from the old world order, like, for instance, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. At the same time, we see a number of new actors in global politics, countries which used to be just regional actors, like Iran, like Brazil, like India. China has become the second world economic power, as you know, having bypassed Japan in August this year by the volume of its GNP. And I think that in this new world order which is emerging, we have to find the right balance. Definitely it should be a more balanced world. But how it will be balanced? And will not a new superpower supplant the old superpower, or will it become a new bipolar world, this time Washington and Beijing being the two new poles of world influence? Those are the questions which are facing us. The idea of the G2, which was aired at a certain point in the United States, is an idea which reflects this fact that there are some people in the United States who would like to have a new bipolar world, but this time not based on the confrontation between Washington and Moscow, but based on interaction between Washington and Beijing. What is Russia's position and what is Russia's policy in this new world? I had already some discussions here in Singapore, and one of my new acquaintances said that Russia is a forgotten superpower. I think that there is something to it, because in the number of areas of the world, Russia stopped to play the role the Soviet Union used to play. The Soviet Union had a global military and political influence and presence. Russia does not have this political influence and military presence. And from this point of view, of course, looking from Singapore, where Russian presence is not very much felt, one can come to the conclusion that it's, if not a forgotten, but at least a dormant superpower. But I think at the same time that Russia is not a regional power. It's more than a regional power. And I will give a list of Russia's, I would say, strong points, which shows that this is a country in a unique position. First, it is geopolitically unique. It occupies the largest part of Eurasia, and Eurasia is basically the most important region of the world, if it can be called a region, because it's a super region by itself. If you look at Eurasia, it goes on from Ireland to Japan, so it's huge. All the natural resources, well, not all of them, of course, but 70% of the world natural resources are concentrated in Eurasia. And all major crises are also concentrated in Eurasia. Take the Middle East crisis, take the Afghan crisis, take the crisis around the Iran nuclear program, Iraq, the Chinese conflicts with the Japanese and with the countries which are arguing about the islands in the South China Sea. The majority of crises, the complicated relationship between India and Pakistan and India and China, it's all Eurasia. And so Russia is the biggest part of Eurasia. It is involved in 5 very important regions. First, Europe, the Middle East, Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Far East. Therefore, Russia is a very active international player by definition, because it has a very special geopolitical position. It plays a key role in European security. It has a special relationship with NATO. It is a strategic partner with China, and every year when a Russian leader goes to China or a Chinese leader comes to Russia, they take a declaration saying that we are strategic partners. So there is a special relationship with China. Russia is member of the BRIC new grouping, which had already a summit in Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains in Russia recently, which groups Brazil, Russia, India, and China. China is member and one of the leading members of the so-called Shanghai Economic Cooperation Organization, which basically brings together Russia, China, Central Asian countries, and there are a number of observers like Iran, Pakistan, and some other countries. Mongolia, which is a member of the Shanghai organization. The United States and NATO has been extremely active recently by by trying to get the Russian endorsement of the NATO war in Afghanistan, because you know that NATO is in a desperate situation in Afghanistan. Obama has been in Delhi those days, and he was talking to India about having some support in Afghanistan, because they're trying to bring everybody of importance to help them in Afghanistan, and now they want our support in Afghanistan. The United States need Russian support in order to try to influence Iran on the well-known issue of its nuclear program. Without Russian support in the Security Council, no sanctions can be adopted against Iran, and so the influence the influence the U.S. want to have on Iran will not be brought to life. We have also been part of the 6-member groups on North Korea, on the North Korean nuclear program. So which brings us to the Far East. We have a very active, although sometimes impetuous, relationship with Japan. So I would say that by the scope of its international activity and involvement in different regions and in different global issues, Russia can be compared only to the United States. By this criteria, there is no other country which would be so much involved in different regional issues, or at least on the Eurasian level, as the United States of America. Russia, as you know, is a member of the Security Council, and this gives Russia a unique leverage. The reason it does is that the attempt of the United States to reject the United Nations, which happened under Bush, has been reconsidered by the Obama administration. The new American choice is not unilateralism, but multilateralism. America, as I said, cannot do it alone, and America wants to take legitimate international actions. As my friend Tom Friedman from the New York Times told me once, America is involved in 3 wars now. The good war in Afghanistan, the bad war in Iraq, and the unrecognized war in Pakistan. So what struck me in this definition was the bad war in Iraq. I said, why is it the bad war and Afghanistan a good war? He said, but of course, the Afghanistan war was supported by the United Nations, and the Iraq war was not supported by the United Nations. And it tells me something. It tells me that the American political class does not want to be once again considered as a kind of rogue state, a rogue superpower which starts wars and basically opposes the international community. So the position in Security Council in those conditions, when multipolarity is establishing itself, when new countries want to join the Security Council, countries like India, like Brazil, like Japan, like Germany, it makes the Security Council, I think, a more important body than it used to be in the last 20 years. Russia remains the second world's nuclear power, which sometimes is forgotten, but it is the only power the United States signed treaty with in the field of nuclear disarmament. I remember Richard Nixon, 3 months before his death in 1994, has wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, and he said that Russian importance for the United States will always be defined by the fact that it is the only country in the world which can destroy the United States of America. I'm not saying that it's a huge plus to be able to destroy the United States of America, but unfortunately we're living in a real, not an ideal world, and in a world where military might counts. And what happens in this field, for instance, Obama's thrust for a global nuclear disarmament, a non-nuclear world, which might seem as a utopia today, but still it's an idea which has caught some attention and some sympathy. This cannot be done without Russia. Russia and the United States possess 95% of the world nuclear potential. China, France, Great Britain, India, Pakistan, and Israel go for the 5%. For the rest. So this is something which does not count too much in today's politics, but which counts a lot in the world power balance. Russia is number one from the point of view of the world energy resources. We are number two by the oil resources after Saudi Arabia, but taken together oil and gas, we are the number one country. And I think that this makes Russia extremely important. Well, the Europeans know it very well. 50% of the gas the Europeans use is bought from Russia, and 25% of oil they use is coming from Russia. Recently, we have built pipelines to China, and also a pipeline is being built to the city of Nakhotka under Vladivostok on the far eastern edge of the Russian Federation. Gas from there will go to Japan and South Korea, and who knows, maybe one day to Singapore. And we are also building an important oil terminal there. So Russian energy resources are extremely important, and I think we will develop a new strategy, a multi-directional strategy. We used to be concentrated on Europe, not anymore. Now, as Asia is growing, as Asia markets are growing, as Asia demand for oil and gas is growing, I think Russia will be moving more and more to the new Asian hemisphere. Russia is also a member of the G8. Well, some people say it's mostly a symbolic group, and I would agree. I think the future lies with the G20, not with the G8. But still, the G8 is an important grouping for especially discussing world economy trends and world policy. And before the crisis, in 2008, we were number 8 in the world by the volume of our GNP. We were in the G8 by the volume of our GNP. Unfortunately, the crisis was very detrimental to the Russian economy. We have lost 9% of our GNP in 2008-2009. Yet we are still number 11 in the world, which is basically also a good figure to take into account that new countries like Brazil, Mexico, South Korea are extremely active and pushing up and competing with the old centers of economic power. The expected growth rate in Russia is smaller than in the first decade of the years 2000. We used to have 7-6% per year. This year the prediction is 4.3, next year 4.2, which is still decent in comparison with Europe, and even with Germany, which is considered to be the champion of European economic development, with 3.2% of growth of GNP in 2010. We managed also to keep a high level of our gold and currency reserves. We have spent $220 billion as an economic stimulus during the crisis. But now our reserves are back to the figure of $520 billion US dollars, which is the third position in the world after Japan and China and Japan. So here we have some security cushion, and the crisis, from the social point of view, we performed much better than countries where the crisis led to serious social unrest, like Greece, like Latvia, like Hungary, and some others. There was no social unrest in Russia, for resources were mobilized to keep the level of life at more or less at the same level that it was before the crisis. So I would call Russia a residual superpower, a superpower which has a lot of elements of might and strength inherited from the past or from its natural position, from natural resources, from its geopolitical position, and from its territory. Will Russia remain an active superpower, or will still stay a residual superpower losing its might? It depends, of course, on the Russian economy, and that's where the economy comes in. And that's why the goal of modernization of the Russian economy, which has been set by the Russian government, and which is being considered the most important task for Russia for the years to come. Not any competition for global influence or any competition with the United States in the field of, say, nuclear weapons. This is not really considered to be relevant. We have enough security, but we don't have enough economy. So we have to build a new economy. Today's Russian economy is mainly resource-based. 80% of our exports is oil and gas, which is definitely wrong in the 21st century. And we should stop our dependence on raw materials, and we should develop a high-tech sector. For the time being, the high-tech sector in Russia is limited to military production. Russia is still good with armaments. We are number 2 in weapons sale in the world after the United States, and in space technologies. For instance, the Americans, after having closed their shuttle program, they use Russian rockets in order to bring their satellites on the orbits around the Earth. But there are very few areas where we can display a high level of technological development, and this is definitely something which breaks our development. In this area, Russia is clearly underperforming, and I think Russia's interest to Singapore, which is growing. We had already 4 Russian-Singapore economic summits in the last 4 years, and by the way, we don't have any kind of summits of this level and in intensity, either with Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia. Just doesn't exist. Singapore is the only country in this area where we have a constant top-level business summit. It just shows that Russia is looking for partners in its modernization effort, and especially in the field of high technologies. Where will Russia be in the 21st century as a political power? This is important. It is important because, for instance, Henry Kissinger once told me that the United States' main problem in the 21st century is not Russia. The United States' main problem is China and the Muslim world. And so in this new configuration of the world, will Russia be an ally to the United States? Will it be allied to China? Will it be an independent center of power? I think a lot depends on this. Right now, there is an ongoing rapprochement between Russia and NATO. And President Medvedev has been invited to the Lisbon summit of NATO, which will take place in the capital of Portugal on November 1920. Maybe you know that this summit is extremely important. NATO is about to adopt a new global strategy. And if it is adopted in its most, I would say, radical version, NATO will stop to be a regional organization. It will become a global organization, dealing not only with military security, but with energy security, information security, and many other types of securities. Will Russia be with NATO in this, or will it stay focused on the United Nations and not supporting NATO's potential preponderance over the United Nations? This is a very important global issue. On the other hand, the Chinese, of course, would not like us to become member of NATO. We have a common border with China, 4,500 kilometers of common border. And the policy of successive Russian governments, from Gorbachev to Medvedev today, was to have a good relationship with China, not to have any problems with China. We have settled the border issue we had for 50 years with the Chinese. Now the border issue is not an issue between Russia and China anymore. And so there are basically no issues between us and China. If we become member of NATO, so it means that NATO will be brought to the Chinese border. I personally think America will not go for it. America will probably refrain from having such a new issue of contention with the Chinese as a member of NATO that is bordering China. But still, this issue is being debated both in Washington and Brussels, also in Moscow. And Russia's choice will be decisive, where Russia will become a member of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, or Russia will remain a power on its own. The choice is between those two things. I'm not talking about a Russian-Chinese military alliance. You know that since Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese idea is no military alliances. Basically, they are against any military alliances, and I think they will not go for it. They want to have their hands free in order to organize their foreign policy in a very sovereign way. So they will not bind themselves by a military alliance with Russia. So the alternative to Russia being a member of NATO is that Russia remains an independent center of power, having a multi-vectored foreign policy, having partnerships with a number of leading actors and new actors, and not binding its hands neither with a set of special obligations toward the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. What makes this relationship, Russia between China and the US, rather complicated is that the United States is considered in Russia as both a counterpart but also as a rival, especially a rival on the post-Soviet space. The Americans tried to build up their influence in Ukraine, in Central Asian republics, in the Caucasus, which is important because pipelines are running from the Caspian oil region to Europe and to the West through the area of Southern Caucasus. That's the main transition area. You cannot go south because in south you have Iran and Afghanistan. So this is a highly endangered area, whereas Caucasus is more or less stable. The United States pay attention even to very small countries on the post-Soviet state, like Moldavia. Although this reflects that America still has this global outreach, and America wants to be present and influential everywhere. China is not seen in Russia as a rival. It is seen as a partner. But with China, there is a big question mark. What will China will become tomorrow? The problem is that nations change. They change when they become weak, and they change when they become powerful. Look at Germany in the 19th century. It was, well, of course, it conducted some wars, but everybody was conducting wars at that time, you know. It was fashionable to have wars, to take territories, you know, and if you were a monarch who did not conduct a war, you were not a monarch, you know. I mean, you were some kind of weird guy who should have been dislodged. But basically, Germany was not a super aggressive country. It was taking part in traditional European politics at that time, and it was listening to Beethoven. You know, it had very nice poets, and everybody was talking about German romanticism. And look at Germany in the 20th century. If you have an image of Germany in the 20th century, it will certainly be not that of a romantic country. It will be the country which started this two wars, actually, two world wars, the first and the second one. This is because Germany got extremely powerful. This is because Germany has become a contender for world domination. So what will happen to China? This is a big question. China used to be an empire. And some people say that China still has this ideology of an empire which is sleeping, but which will come back at a certain point. On the other hand, the Chinese leadership since the last 30 years is stressing all the time that China has no expansionist interest, that China is mostly concentrated on domestic development, that China is still a developing country with no huge international ambitions. I think that China is also in a state of transition. And at some point, it will become clear what China will become. 5 years ago, the Chinese did not have intercontinental ballistic missiles which were capable of striking Washington, D.C. Now they do have such missiles. The Chinese are probably the second country in the world which spends by the level of military spending. A big part of Chinese GNP goes for military means. China has displayed a certain, I would say, assertiveness in those contentious issues with Japan over the Senkaku Islands and on some other territorial issues. So it does not concern Russia for the time being directly. Russia has no pretensions towards Russia. There is a kind of creeping demographic expansion. The Russian Far East is underpopulated. We have only about 7 million people living there. Over the border, we have 90 million in the adjacent regions of Chinese. And it's only natural they are slowly coming. Some of them are marrying Russian women, by the way. And it creates, on the one hand, it's good, because especially for those women, probably. On the other hand, it creates a problem. Will the Chinese minority in a certain time not become a majority? And so if you talk to Russians who are living, for instance, in the European part of Russia, do you think China is a threat? They will say, no, it's not a threat. But yes, it is. Yes, when it comes to the demographic issue. Once again, the Chinese government stresses that it is not a policy. They are not helping these people to come on Russian territory. But I think that this is a more or less natural phenomena. You know, it's like if the territory invites new population, then the new population comes. There are a lot of resources. There is a demand for a working force, and so the Chinese are slowly coming. So some people say that in the long run, for instance, probably our mutual acquaintance, Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, says that Russia in 40, 50 years will lose this Siberia and the Far East to China. Well, Mao Zedong used to have territorial demands to Russia. He used to say that the Russian Tsars have taken about 1 million square kilometers of Chinese territory. And it was a request which you can see on some Chinese maps. A big part of Siberia and the Far East are being joined on those maps to China. But once again, it happened at the times of Mao Zedong. I mean, this slogan was formulated in the times of Mao Zedong. Since this time, the Chinese did not really go back to this demand. So we hope they will not. They will not. But once again, if China becomes a true superpower, who knows how will it affect its foreign policy and strategic thinking. Finally, Russia and the Southeast Asia region. I think this is a fairly new region for Russia, basically. Russian tourists are coming in thousands, of course, here. Mostly to Malaysia, to Singapore, much less. They are discovering also Thailand, they are discovering Indonesia. They are very popular destinations. But I think that Southeast Asia is extremely interesting for Russia. It's extremely interesting, first because there is Singapore. Singapore is the finance and economic center of the region. And I think it is not by chance that the Russian Singapore Business Forum is taking place here. The Russian business looks at Singapore as the central point from where it can make investments in the area. Second, Russia, I think, can offer certain things to Singapore and the area. There are some talks about the possibility of building a nuclear power station in Vietnam. It has been discussed during President Medvedev's visit to Hanoi on the ASEAN summit recently. And as you know, nuclear energy, of course, is controversial for security reasons. But on the other hand, it is probably the energy of the future to a large extent. And so this is an area where Russia has a lot of experience. Rosatom, it is the biggest Russian, well, actually the only one, Russian state company which is building nuclear power stations abroad, is building now 18 nuclear power reactors all over the world. So nuclear energy might be one field of cooperation. Russia needs badly new technologies in the field of information, medicine, education, and Singapore, for instance, provide for such. Russian trade with Singapore, interesting enough, is growing very, very quickly. In 2008, it grew by 22%. In 2009, by 43%. And now we are at the same level by the volume of trade as the Russian-Japanese trade. Well, unfortunately, I would say that it says that the Russian-Japanese trade is not a big one. Yes, but it's 3.8 billion US dollars with Japan and 3.8 Singapore dollars between Russia and Singapore. But it shows also that Singapore is not Japan. And so such level of trade is, and the growth of this trade is extremely impressive. Finally, I find quite a few Russians who are decided to come to Singapore and to stay at least for a while or maybe even forever in Singapore. And asking them how do they feel in Singapore, basically I got the impression they feel very well. So this is also very important because, you know, sometimes you come to a foreign country and something is wrong. I don't know, but something, you know, you feel not quite good, you'd better stay in your hotel. In Singapore, you'd better stay out of the hotel. It's a nice place to be. And I think if there is not such a thing as a Chinese way of life, there is definitely a Singapore way of life, which makes Singapore very attractive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very, very comprehensive. You know, one of the mysteries that I have is that in the 1990s, there was a kind of a love affair between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, you know. They seemed to hug each other all the time and, you know, they were very close. And then, of course, came the first decade of the 21st century, and even though Bush could see into Putin's soul, there was a lot of tension, basically, between Putin and the United States of America, partly because of Kosovo, partly because of Iraq, partly because of expansion of NATO, you know, and things like that. But now it seems that once again, the love affair is coming back, and you're now going to participate in the NATO meeting that you mentioned taking place. So what happened? Why did you have a love affair? Why did you fall out of love, and why are you falling in love again?
It's a good question. First, I think we are past love affairs between presidents. I don't think that love affairs between presidents is a healthy thing. And I suppose that love affairs actually should be based on the balance of interests, not so much on a personal relationship. A personal relationship helps for sure, and it gives you additional possibility to influence your counterpart and so on. I think in the times of Bill and Boris, the mistake Boris Yeltsin made was to think that the personal relationship, this constant hugging, would really give him some influence over Bill Clinton. But Clinton was much more smarter. Yeltsin was hugging Clinton, just hugging. And Clinton had an idea why he was hugging Yeltsin.
You're speaking his pockets.
Yeah, I think so. And he got a lot from Yeltsin. He got a lot from Yeltsin. When hugging did not help, he would give Yeltsin a glass or two of wine, and that would help more even. So Putin is not Yeltsin. Yeltsin was emotional in some way. You know, he was a kind of revolutionary leader. He came to destroy communism. He didn't build a lot, I have to say. He destroyed. He was a good demolition man. But he was not much of a builder. Putin is a very different person. Putin is rather cold. I mean, he can be emotional, and he has a good relationship, for instance, with Berlusconi. They are both self-made men, and you know, they are both tough guys. But Putin is rather cold, and I wonder how Bush managed to see into his soul at the very first meeting. Because if you look into Putin's eyes, there are like shutters, you know, there. And he doesn't open them very often to very few people. Putin is very calculating, and he's consummate political animal. So I think probably he wanted to charm Bush to a certain extent, and that's his charm was what Bush has taken for his soul, but it's a difference. The breakup between Russia and the United States happened in spite of a good personal relationship. You know, it was good until almost the very end. It was decent, a decent relationship between two leaders. By the way, Bush was extremely happy that Putin called him the next day after September 11 and said that Russia is with you in your war against terror. He was the first to call him. And he gave practical support to the United States in Afghanistan. We gave some intelligence information to the Americans. We helped them actually to establish bases in Central Asia. Now we are not very much happy with this, but at that point we helped them, and Bush used to compare Putin to his allies, to Chirac and Schröder, and he would say that Putin behaved as an ally, and these two guys as enemies, because you know that France and Germany did not support the Iraq war. We didn't neither, but then we are not members of NATO. We are not American military and political allies. I think the reason was for this breakup that Putin wanted a quid pro quo with the United States of America. He saw that I will support Bush where Bush needs it most, in Afghanistan, in the war against terror, in the fields where America feels that Russia is necessary to the United States. And the United States will refrain from trying to push Russia from the former Soviet republics. That, I think, was the deal Putin wanted to make, that America will refrain from trying to build its influence at the Russian expense, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Kazakhstan, in even very small countries like Moldova, which I think probably only the Secretary of State and the probably Minister of Defense in the United States have heard about. Certainly Bush did not know Moldova before he came to the White House. I even doubt he knows it today. But they paid attention even to the smallest spots on the map of the former Soviet Union. But Americans took a very different turn. They said, you should support us because it is in your best interest to support the United States of America. First, we are the most democratic. Second, we are the most free. Third, we are a shining temple on top of a hill, and so on. And fifth, we are the best in the world. And Putin went to the United States. They had a very nice meeting with Bush in Crawford. That's where Bush lives, where his residence is in Texas.
What year was that?
It was November 2001. And they had a very nice meeting. It was a lot of friendship, soul-searching. And Putin definitely, and we in Moscow, back in Moscow, were waiting for a certain quid pro quo for the United States at that point. And Bush gave Putin a Texan hat. And we said, well, maybe there will be something will follow. Next day, they have shown us TV footage that he gave Putin barbecue. And unfortunately, it stopped there. Then there was a declaration by the US administration that the United States will proceed to the second wave of NATO enlargement, which means taking in the Baltic states, which have a common border with Russia, which we didn't like, of course. And on December 6th, the United States walked out of the ABM Treaty, which was active for 30 years. And they said they kind of, they proceeded to decoupling the American strategic security from Russian strategic security. They said, we want free hands in building our own ABM system, and we don't want this treaty to be limiting us. And then things began to pile up. Basically, what we saw is that America wants us to support their interests, but not want to take into account our interests, neither in the field of security nor in the field of geopolitics. What changed? when Obama came, there was a lot of talk in the United States. Condoleezza Rice used to talk a lot about this, that Russia should be isolated. Why Russia should have been isolated? Because we had a small war with Georgia, 5 days war in August 2008. At the center was the fate of two very small territories, Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, two small republics, which wanted to, well, in a way like Kosovo to a certain extent, wanted to break away from Georgia. Because they accused Georgia of having a very negative policy towards those two republics. And Mr. Saakashvili, that's the president of Georgia, on one night attacked Southern Ossetia, where Russian peacekeepers were. And about 45 Russian peacekeepers were dead during this military operation. Russia riposted, and we had a war with Georgia. Then we recognized Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia as independent states. So after this, we had a very big problem with the United States and the European Union. Richard Cheney was calling for Russian isolation, Condoleezza Rice. And so when Obama came, the test was what he will say, isolation or cooperation. He just forgot about this war, Obama. He said, we need to have a reset. We start from a new piece of paper, from a clean piece of paper. And basically then Obama came to Moscow, and his message was, we are not here to lecture you, we are not here to assert our interest over yours, we're here to understand and to find a common way of acting. And this is a positive message. But I wouldn't say that it's once again a love affair. For instance, Medvedev and Obama do not hug each other. They tap each other at the shoulder, being careful.
Good. Okay, one first question here, please.
Yes, I'm Dayan Jatileka, until last year Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the UN in Geneva, and on my way to Paris to represent my country again early in the new year. Let me start off with something that Professor Mahbubani said. I myself was surprised that Foreign Minister Lavrov actually spoke better Sinhalese than I did, but that's just an aside. Professor Pushkov, isn't it the case that at least from Reykjavik, 86, until fairly recently, the system in the United States, apart from the presidents and their approaches, but the strategic machine, as it were, has made it clear that Russia would not be conceded the strategic space that is in consonance with Russia's own weight and self-respect. This seems to me to be the lesson of the last 15 years. And if that is indeed the case, is Russia's foreign policy best served by what you described the multi-vector, grand goalist policy? This is one option. Or a kind of something like what Lenin said on his deathbed, the fact that India, China, Russia, Persia comprise the vast majority of the world's population, and therefore the geopolitics indicates a kind of tilt towards the east. Aren't these the only two options realistically open, and isn't looking again at NATO some sort of delusion, a strategic delusion? If I may add a postscript to that question, how do you rate the strategic thinking and the foreign policy thinking of Evgeny Primakov, who, it seems to me, had a remarkably coherent notion of Russia's interest in foreign policy in this transitional post-Soviet period that you're talking about? Thank you.
Yours is a very complicated question, for I think very few here in this audience have probably a clear idea of Evgeny Primakov ideas. Primakov used to be our prime minister and foreign minister, but basically he was behind the idea of Russia being an independent center of power and influence. We have a debate in Russia these days. Where should Russia go? Or, for instance, some people imply that it should not go nowhere, actually. It has a big territory. It can stand both feet on this territory. It has not necessarily to go east or west. But still, there is the so-called Western temptation. And there is a concept which says that if we become closer to the United States and NATO, the West will help the modernization of Russian economy. And that will, where the investment will come from, and that's where the high technologies will come from, and so on and so on. So a kind of trade-off. We support NATO strategically, and the West supports us economically. It's an idea which is being espoused by President Medvedev, and it has its own merits. My only doubt is that we may end up supporting NATO strategically but not getting the help. It happens very often. The reason is that, to my mind, Russian economic development does not depend on NATO. And it depends on the domestic conditions for business, the contest of ideas, competition, and so on. So in order to develop economically, to my mind, we should not so much look into Obama's soul, but we should look into our own soul and just find the way, like successful countries did, countries like China, like Singapore, some others, to establish the best possible domestic climate for innovation and development. That's where I think the secret lies. It does not mean we should not have a good relationship with the West. I'm all for it, but I don't think that we should think that somebody will modernize Russia on Russia's place. And so there is a debate between those two positions, whether we should be more pro-Western or more self-centered, I would say. Are those the only two viable alternatives? Well, I think yes, because if Russia remains an independent center of power, then it is absolutely open to this interaction with Brazil, India, Southeast Asia, China. It gives us more maneuver, to my mind. There is a certain paradox. At the moment when the world is moving east, and as is rightly said in your book, and in many books,
Please buy the book.
and in many books, if the world moves east, should Russia move west? That's an interesting paradox. The West has still a lot of appeal, but should we tie our hands by formal alliances in the times when I think the world is changing so quickly? That would better take a bit of time in order to have a better judgment.
My name is Juan Camilo Bejarano. I would like to change the region. And the question is, what is the strategic position of Russia in South America? If you meant that Russia is selling weapons to Venezuela, breaking the military balance, and doing military exercises in the Caribbean Sea in a region highly influenced by the United States.
I'm Nobuku Nishinohara, MPP student in Kuan Yew School. I think Japan is also another country located between United States and China, but you didn't mention about Japan a lot, and I'm just wondering, do you have any aspiration about Russia-Japan relation, or is Japan a marginal actors in Russian foreign policies? Recently your president visited, disputed islands, but do you have any comment about that? Or, yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Azamat. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. My question is, you mentioned a lot about the residual power and how big it is, how militarily strong it is, and how resourceful it is in terms of hard power. What does Russia have in terms of soft power? You haven't talked, you didn't mention that. You might think that in the 21st century, soft power is so much more important than the hard power. You mentioned, and another question is, what does Russia offer to the world and might offer to the world in the next 20 years, apart from its military power?
Well, first about Latin America, I would not overestimate Russian presence in Latin America, and these maneuvers in the Caribbean, I think they were largely symbolic, and they had to do with this rift between Moscow and Washington in the times of the Bush administration. So, mostly, I would say it was just a return in a way. America has military maneuvers on the adjacent territory of the adjacent republics, and so Russia has wanted to show that we can do it too. As for selling armaments to Venezuela, well, you know, Russia is selling armaments to the buyer. This is basically the logic of international trade. Mr. Chavez is interested. He thinks he has problems with Colombia. He is not very secure with the United States, and he has a reason, because the United States were behind the coup d'etat in 2001 when they tried to dislodge Chavez. And after this, Chavez, you remember, came to the United Nations and called Bush the devil. In the United Nations, he said that it smells like a devil has been standing here on this podium, because he spoke right after Bush, and of course did not help the relationship, you know. And they have been buying important amounts of modern armaments, so we sold it to them. We have some joint projects with Brazil. They're also interested in our nuclear power plants. But Russia's military presence in Latin America is rather small. Political influence, yes, if you talk about Cuba and Venezuela, but well, and Brazil being maybe of BRIC now, we have a kind of new political relationship, but still it's a continent where our influence is much less important than it used to be in the Soviet times. In the Soviet times, the Soviet Union had an idea which is exported. Maybe it was a wrong idea, but still it had a lot of appeal, especially in poor countries, as you know. And of course, Latin America was on the receiving end, and the relationship was multi-faced, and we supported the left-wing regimes. We supported Salvador Allende in Chile, and we supported the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and so on. Now we are not competing with the United States for this kind of ideological influence. We're not exporting any ideas. So the only field where we can come to this area is the field of economy. Once again, that's why for Russia today, paradoxically enough, it is the Bill Clinton slogan which is important. It's the economy stupid. You remember, Bill Clinton won the elections using this slogan. So I would say for Russia, the most important thing today is the economy. And if the economy works, I think we will have much more presence in Latin America too. Japan. I think you are from Japan, as far as I understand. Yes.
He's a student in our school.
Yes, I got it. Well, Japan is a country which is very highly viewed in Russia, highly viewed for its modernization experience, for the results of its economic development in the 20th century. And when Russians study some economic modernization efforts, this is mostly Japan, South Korea, and China. So in the intellectual, I would say, field, Japan is very much present. But as I noticed in my talk, we don't have a very large relationship with Japan in the economic field. As I said, $3.5 billion US dollars, it's $0.8 billion US dollars, it's a small trade in comparison with Japan trades with China or the United States. One of the reasons is those 4 islands of the, which are called the Kuril Islands, which are being disputed between, they were disputed between Soviet Union and Japan, and now we have inherited this dispute. The Japanese maintain that 4 islands should be Japanese. But as Russia has the sovereignty over those islands, and the sovereignty was established after the Second World War, and nobody disputes, by the way, this sovereignty. It is recognized as a territory of the Russian Federation. Then it becomes a kind of impasse. It's a deadlock. It's interesting that in the Far East, it's always about islands. You see, everybody has disputes about islands. So every big state has its own islands it wants to have. So we have this problem with Japan, and this creates a constant negative setting for the relationship. There are a lot of contacts, a lot of Japanese politicians coming to Moscow, a lot of Russians coming to Japan, a lot of nice words. Everything is good until it comes to the islands. And that's the difference with China, by the way. They have a big trade with Japan, but a very harsh tonality, on political level. Between Russia and Japan, basically both sides tend to not to make it too sharp. This last rift over President Medvedev's visit to one of the Kuril Islands, it's an exception. The Japanese government reacted very strongly to this. And also the Japanese government issued a warning before Mr. Medvedev went there. They said, we would not like it to happen. And Mr. Medvedev said, well, it's our territory, for the time being at least. And so he made a point of going there. So I think if the Japanese government did not issue this warning, maybe he would not have been going. But as they said, don't go there. It will affect our relationship. So imagine the Russian president, what does he have to do? We have a public opinion too. And people were waiting for him to go there. And to, I mean, it's all very about symbolism, but this is a kind of symbolism which plays in politics. If, the problem is that in 1955, the Soviet leadership, Nikita Khrushchev, offered the Japanese a solution. You take 2 islands of the 4 disputed. We have 2. But we have offered them at that time the smaller islands, of course. And we wanted to keep the bigger ones. And the Japanese, of course, said no. Since that time, there is a deadlock. So we have to find a solution. I mean, but on the other hand, you know that very few states give away their territory. I remember this conflict between Morocco and Spain. There is a rock 150 meters from the Moroccan soil. There are only birds there. Maybe some crabs, but not a lot. And so at some point, when the Spanish were busy with building up their economic future, the Moroccans decided that this rock should be taken from the Spanish. And they sent a ship with 15 military guys who occupied the rock. And you can imagine 3 military ships were sent from Spain to take back the rock. Because the rock is Spanish. And it is disputed until now. Nobody wants to give away its territory. And that's still, although you are absolutely right, soft power is important. But for some reason, people don't want to share their territory with other countries. Otherwise, we like Japan very much.
Any response on soft power?
And soft power. And soft power. Every nation has its own problems. We have a problem with soft power. But still, I think Russia may have a positive influence. First, as you have noticed, we did not use our military might intensively in the last years. This war with Georgia, which was started by the Georgian side, is the only exception. And a lot of people comparing the experience of the Yugoslavia breakup, which led to a huge confrontation between the Serbs, the Croatians, the Muslims in Yugoslavia. There was dozens of thousands of people killed and 2 million refugees as a result of the partition, this conflictual partition of Yugoslavia. A lot of observers who came to Russia said, we're absolutely amazed at how you managed to break up without any military confrontation. There was no military confrontation on the post-Soviet space. I mean, not any confrontation between Russia and the republics which broke away. Although Russia could have used its military might, of course it's the most powerful country on this space. So when I said that we have some military might, I wanted to say that it's still important in world politics. I did not want to say that I like it very much or that we will use it very much. Now, with soft power, what we can do? I think we can contribute very much to a better world, to this new world order I was talking about. You see, what changed in Russia and what has not yet changed in America? When the Soviet Union fell down, we understood we cannot remodel the world according to our wishes. Full stop. we will evolve with the world, we will observe the world, we will try to influence the world, but we will not say we are the best in the world and we want the world to be like us. This is a moment of the past. That's where America has not yet come. If you listen to Sarah Palin, for instance, who is basically a very nice person probably, but the things she says are absolutely horrendous, absolutely horrendous. She's all about American hegemony. And I spoke once to George Soros, and I asked him, did Iraq have a deep influence on American political mentality? Did Iraq taught the United States it cannot remodel the world according to its own image and according to its own wishes? I was absolutely amazed to hear that he said, no, there should be 2 more wars like the war in Iraq so that the American political class understands that it cannot remodel the world. Well, maybe this Soros is a Democrat, and it was at the time of Bush administration, so it was his sophisticated criticism of the Bush administration. But at the same time, look at how American evolution to a more realistic worldview is uneven. Look at this right-wing backlash in the United States. So I think Russia has parted with this global power heritage. We do not consider ourselves in a position, also in a right, to dictate anything to others. And this makes, unlike the United States, I think the United States are in the beginning of this road. And I think this makes us a very, potentially very good player. For we can, to my mind, counterbalance negative trends and support positive trends in world politics. Because we don't want hegemony. So we are interested in a balanced world. We are willing to give some support, for instance, to the countries which may play a bigger role in the United Nations. You know that the reform of the Security Council is looming. And the Japanese are coming to Moscow, the Indians are coming to Moscow, the Brazilians, they say, will you support our bid for the position in the Security Council of the United Nations? So Russia is a key player in what will be the configuration of the UN, of the Security Council, of the whole world order. And I think having parted with this hegemonistic idea of the times of the Soviet Union, we can play a very positive role. Well, there are some other elements of soft power. We have culture, for instance, which is not being disputed. I think that we can become a leading energy exporter for the world, and an energy exporter which once again will not dictate, but try to find a common language with those who use our oil and gas, and take into account the reserves we have. Russia, Siberia, and the northern part of Russia can be a huge international operation. Already now there are a lot of American, Japanese companies on Sakhalin, which are extracting oil there, and we have some huge gas reserves in the northern seas. The French, the Norwegians are cooperating with us on extracting this gas from the seabed. And so I think that whether it is soft power or not soft power, it's energy power, but I think we are willing to share it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Professor Pushkov, fantastic talk, and you finish your talk by welcoming the people that stay in Singapore. I mean, I got 2 Russian ladies next to me. They've been here 10 years. You say the Singapore way of life, which is comfortable, because when you come to a country, you like it. Can you elaborate to us, how do you see the Chinese way of life, which we have not talked about a lot, because you mentioned about US and Russia. How do you define the Russian way of life and the American way of life in the 3 contexts of the title? The second question I have is that rather than Russia between US and China, can you elaborate a little bit how you feel that China should be between Russia and US? Because it used to be Russia and US. China is the new boy on the block. So maybe if you can elaborate a little bit on that. The third one is US has got the last one, 5th command, which is the internet. We're talking about a new threat, basically, not basically the economics and the military. Can we share your views to us, please?
Well, your questions about 3 ways of life is definitely demanding another hour. Yeah.
You have 5 minutes.
I understand. I have 2 minutes for this. Well, I will not be speaking about the American way of life. You know it very well. Yes. Now, is there a Russian way of life? Not yet, I think. Not yet. I think one of our biggest problems is the huge disparity between the extremely well-to-do and the not well-to-do. Russia occupies the 71st place by the United Nations calculus from the point of view of level of life, conditions of life. And it occupies the second and third place, competing with China, by the number of billionaires. We have now, and for me it's not a matter of pride, we have now 143 billionaires. So they have a very nice way of life, I can assure you. But it's not a Russian way of life. And that's the problem, because they tend to live abroad, to buy property mostly abroad, their kids are studying in Switzerland, in France, in England, and so on and so on. So we have this very small minority, which is extremely rich, and a big gap between this extreme minority and the majority of the population. And I think, I don't want it to become the Russian way of life, although there is a trend towards this, that Russia will here be not like a country, say a developed country, where the balances are much more soft, but like an underdeveloped country, where usually those balances are very uneven. As for the Chinese way of life, I don't think it has established itself neither. I've been to China, watching the Chinese. I think for the time being, there is a national idea in China. We should be the first. Like Obama coming from China in November 2009, he said, these guys will not play for the second place. And look at the Chinese at the Olympic Games. They will not play for the second place. So there is a national ideology that China should become the country, the power. How will it reflect itself on the level of of everyday's life? For me, it's hard to say for the time being. Of course, you know that 750 million people live in the countryside, and the countryside is very poor. And you cannot have everybody in Shanghai, because if you have everybody in Shanghai, it will stop to be Shanghai. Also, there is the question of political system. When I visited China, I understood why the Chinese, when the Americans say, you should have a democracy, and the Chinese, you know, they always, very politely, they say, no, thank you. Why do they say no, thank you? Because democracy in China will be the end of the Chinese economic miracle. This kind of development can be asserted only through a centralized political power. My feeling is that the Americans understand this very well. That's why they suggest democracy for China. And now, China between Russia and the United States. Hard to say. I think that in this triangle, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, we are stronger than China only in the field of this residual military might and resources. Otherwise, China is getting much stronger than Russia in the field of economy and finance. Chinese reserves are $2.6 trillion. It's something nobody can compete with. So China between Russia and the United States, I don't think that, you see, this bipolar system, Washington, Moscow, it existed in the 20th century. It's not here anymore. It's not here anymore. And the Chinese has espoused this point of view that they will be building their own might, as I said, no military alliances with anyone. They will build a new China, which will be sovereign and independent of other centers of power. So I don't think they consider themselves as a power between Russia and America. I think that they consider themselves as a power which can challenge the United States. That's their new ideology. They don't talk about it too often because they don't think that they have enough strength for this. But the more strong they get, the more you will hear about the China should, even today the language is slightly different than 10 years ago. Now 10 years ago, when the United States would make massive weapons sales to China, to Taiwan, the Chinese would keep shut. They would keep silent. Now, the last time the Americans announced a big arms sales to Taiwan, there was a huge scandal. The Chinese were adamantly against. There were crowds outside of the American embassy in Beijing protesting against this. So there is a new language which appears in China. I think that's the language of a future challenger. And finally, the internet. The Americans command the internet. On the one hand, it's true. On the other hand, I see that I'm not sure they will be able to control the internet. Look at this WikiLeaks affair. It hurts the United States. I think that if the United States develop their positive soft power, which is present in America, then they will be very strongly controlling the internet, because they have a lot to offer in the intellectual, humanitarian field. But if they rely more on military actions and on such, negative things as torture, this Abu Ghraib story and so on, the internet will work against them. So I think it's in the best interest of the United States to boost their soft power and to minimize their military power in politics.
Well, you can see that we've been very, very privileged to have Professor Alexey Pushkov here. You've had a fascinating tour of the world, and you've had a very good understanding now of how Russia sees the world in many ways quite differently. This has been a massive education for us. We thank you for that. But I also want to thank Professor Alexey Pushkov, because in many ways, when you look at it, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Russia is one of the biggest countries in the world. Singapore is one of the smallest countries in the world. Russia is playing in the big league. It should be, with the United States, China, Brazil, India. And here it has time for a small country like Singapore. And I must say that we are actually very pleased, as you mentioned in your remarks, there's within Southeast Asia, it's quite remarkable that Russia's relations with Singapore are much more developed than the other Southeast Asian countries. One more remark,
Sure. If a Soviet leader would come to Singapore, to today's Singapore, he would think that this is communism.
we actually we actually discussed that in my office, and it was it's true that if you look at the standard of living for people at the top, middle, and the bottom, this is basically what a good communist society should be looking like. So maybe perhaps Russians come to Singapore because they feel nostalgic for the communist party. So thank you very much.